Welcome and thanks for joining us for another episode of Code Girls on Air, a podcast exploring all things technology, female leadership, careers, education, and topics within the nonprofit sector. On this episode, we will be interviewing Morgan Delaney, who is the Director of Video Production at DeliverFund, a nonprofit that combats human trafficking, and the host of the podcast Hello Whitefish. So let's join Kelsey and Morgan to hear more about his story.
Hello, I am Kelsey, a current intern at Code Girls United and former student. We are here today with Morgan Delaney from Hello Whitefish. How are you, Morgan?
Hello, Code Girls United. I'm doing great. I'm really happy to be here. This is an honor.
Good. We're excited to have you, Morgan.
Thanks.
Well, I guess we'll just kind of jump right in. So start with telling us a little bit about you and your journey and how you got to Whitefish and where you are right now.
Well, how I got to Whitefish is a really interesting story. Unlike most people that I think come to Montana and the Flathead Valley, my family came here accidentally. I was born in a really beautiful coastal town called Laguna Beach, California, and that's where all my family is from. And my parents decided they wanted to kind of live somewhere else to raise me. And so my dad went on a road trip through the Pacific Northwest, and his car broke down in Hungry Horse. And this is in 1981 when it was a lot different back then. So he ended up staying in Whitefish for about a week while his car got fixed, and met a nice realtor named Jeannie Tallman and found an awesome 30-acre ranch. And he was a novelist at the time, so he had actually just sold a book. He had a couple New York Times bestsellers. And so just through fate, really, my family ended up here. And yeah, and so this was in the 80s, and back then it was really interesting because Whitefish back then was a little more rough around the edges. There was a lot more dirt roads. Right. It was like more of a ski bum and railroad worker culture in that area. And so I just got to have this kind of really cool upbringing, living in a log cabin that didn't have gas. We had electricity, but we cooked our meals on a wood cook stove, which meant we had to like build a fire in this cast iron stove. And that's how we made all of our meals. So it was like my parents were really kind of like getting back to just living a really minimal life that I think people want to live when they come up to Montana. But it was interesting because a little backstory about my dad, which will lead into where I am now, is he was the son of a World War II Marine, eventually moved to LA after that, became a writer for some music industry magazines, found his way to a job at Capitol Records as the national press manager for a band called the Beatles. I don't know if the Beatles are still a thing, but they were pretty big back then. And so he got super tight with them. And then when they broke up, he ended up becoming an actor in the 70s, and then became a novelist, and then eventually they moved to Montana. So my dad was really good at reinventing himself, and I kind of like looked up to that quite a bit. I kind of like to think he was an early hacker in a way, because hacking is all about learning a system inside and out, and then learning how to remanipulate that system for creative ways or other ways. And so he kind of taught me how to do that in life. And so that's kind of what I have done with my life too. So I went to Whitefish High School here, was really into punk rock and skateboarding and counterculture stuff in Montana. Like growing up in Montana, my friends and I were going to punk rock shows in Missoula and Kalispell and Great Falls. And so I grew up with Montana being this kind of like rural but punk rock spot.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so it was really cool. And I kind of then moved to California, moved to the Bay Area, where my parents moved before me to do a semiconductor startup company. So my parents were really tech forward growing up. And so ended up moving back to California, was in the Bay Area for about 4 years, moved down to Los Angeles to go to music school because I was a musician as well. And so I went to music school down there, got to play in some really cool, everything from R&B to death metal to disco to doo-wop. And so when I was living in LA, I was doing that. And then at that time, I had got into TV production as a writer and a producer because I actually had a background in writing stemming from my time in high school, getting into journalism. I kind of got into writing because my dad was a writer, and I just love telling stories, and the power of telling stories is really important. And so eventually got into TV production, did that for a while, for about 10 years. And then I ended up moving back to Montana in 2015 and just really kind of got back into the culture here that had obviously changed quite a bit. And then a year ago is when I started my podcast, Hello Whitefish. And I kind of started Hello Whitefish because I felt like there was a need to have more in-depth conversations surrounding issues that were impacting us Montanans, especially in the Flathead Valley. And I just felt like, with social media, I would see like go on Facebook or Instagram and there would be a news article and people would just be leaving like really dumb, nasty comments that I just was like, I feel like we need to humanize people that are in the media, that are important members of the community. Let's have better conversations around, whatever is happening. So
absolutely,
kind of just started Hello Whitefish for the fun of it. And just started interviewing my friends who just ended up being really interesting people. And it's become pretty popular, I guess. And it's just fun. I just love talking to people and learning their stories and sharing them with everybody else.
Yeah. So can you go into a little more depth on so you came back to Whitefish, you were here for a while. What kind of sparked your interest in kind of getting back into technology and starting this podcast?
Oh, totally. Well, it's interesting because the whole the studio where I do Hello Whitefish, I built that studio for a nonprofit called DeliverFund. DeliverFund is a counter human trafficking intelligence and technology company or nonprofit. And so the CEO, Nick McKinley, I actually met him through a few people, through Jamie Gogan, and then he reached out to me because 60 Minutes was producing a news story about human trafficking and stuff, and they needed someone to interview him. So they hired me to interview Nick, and then he brought me on to DeliverFund to do all their video production. And he was doing a lot of media at the time, so he needed a studio where he could go and just do podcasts, or if he was going to be on the news, he needed a pretty high-tech studio. And so I got hired on to DeliverFund to do that. And then he was basically like, if we're not using the studio, he kind of told all the employees, start your own podcast. Like, let's utilize this space. Like, let's not just use it for the Nick McKinley show. He's very generous and humble and knows like the importance of people having access to tell their stories or whatever. And so, it was just a really fun way to kind of take 10 years of TV production experience that I had, mostly doing. So my background in TV production is mostly producing TV shows for like Discovery Channel, History Channel, National Geographic. I think I did a Vice show. So a lot of like more documentary style stuff. And when I was producing those shows, I was doing mostly a lot of field producing. And a field producer, what they do is they'll go out. So for example, I was doing a lot of crime documentaries, like a lot of those investigation discovery crime shows you see. So I would go out, I would be sent out to go interview like homicide detectives or journalists or sometimes family members of victims. And so I kind of got really good at interviewing people and asking them questions. And so I just kind of took that experience and applied it to just interviewing people around topics that I just find interesting.
Right.
So, I mean, that's kind of what's fun about a podcast is coming from a TV background where you've got the production company that you're working for and you've got your executive producers and then you've got the network and you have all these people that are kind of giving input onto the show you're working on. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of hierarchy.
Yeah, right.
But with Hello Whitefish and probably what you guys are doing, it's like you can you have so much more freedom, which is why I just love doing podcasts.
Yeah,
because you can just do whatever you want. You can make it your own story, your own style.
Yeah.
Like you can make it look however you want. You're set in studios. It's really fun. And it's cheaper and it's more accessible. Having a more variety of cameras and tools that are really, I didn't have access to when I was younger. Like when I was a teenager, I definitely would have been doing this. So that's what's really cool. That's what I love about doing podcasts and just how much more accessible it is for people to share their stories.
Right. Yeah. And it sounds like Jamie Gogan was kind of a big part of that startup of the podcast. I'm curious, were there any other kind of key people that were a part of your journey or have kind of stuck with you along the way through the podcast?
Definitely my boss, Nick. I mean, he's been very supportive in letting me do this in DeliverFund, but it's been a very valuable tool, not just for Hello Whitefish, but for DeliverFund because we're able to bring people in to learn more about what DeliverFund does, which is a really, DeliverFund's more of a national organization. So he's been great. My partner, Jessica, who helped me flesh out the idea from the early inception, she's been very supportive. And I think just the community, the people that follow my podcast are like the biggest supporters. I would, even if I didn't have anybody watching my show, I would probably still be doing it just because I find it so fun just to talk to people. And I'm just so fascinated by people's stories because they're so unique. And I just find, this is going to sound weird, but kind of like on the technological thing, like I feel like humans are the most innovative form of technology the universe has created.
Absolutely.
That we have seen yet. Maybe there's other societies out there. So it's just so fascinating that we get to know so much about the universe and taking that fascination and just applying it to Montana, which is such a fascinating state to grow up in.
Yeah.
Did you grow up here?
Yes, I did. I grew up here, born and raised, Kalispell, Montana.
Nice.
But yeah, I think it's great to be able to use podcasts like this or like Hello Whitefish and just get to shed light on everything that's happening around you and actually allow people to hear more about it. So I think that's awesome that you've been able to do that with your podcast journey.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And with that, I would also ask, what are ways that you have either grown or big things that you've realized since starting the podcast? It sounds like you started it about a year ago.
Yeah,
right?
I started it. I think I launched my first episode May of 2023. So a little bit over a year now.
Great. Awesome. So what are some of the biggest things since starting that podcast that you've either noticed an effect it's had on the people around you, or you can talk about podcasts as a whole and the effect that it has on our community and the people around us?
I think it's just, I think humans have an inherent need to hear stories. I think that goes back to like tribal days of people sitting around a fire, sharing stories.
Absolutely.
And just kind of like learning from the elders or from other tribes coming in and sharing their knowledge and wisdom, or, hey, there's this dangerous tribe we got to watch out for. It's just, I think it helps people grow individually and together when we can all kind of hear these in-depth conversations. And so I just go into every conversation like a blank slate. Like, I'm here to learn what you have to tell me. The one thing I know is that I don't know anything.
Right.
Really, that's how I approach it. Just from like a curiosity standpoint of just wanting to really hear just a sincere, like I just approach every conversation with an open heart and just really sincerely want to hear what people have to say.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Even down to my 4-year-old daughter, I'm trying to get her on the podcast because
yeah.
I want to know what's in her little heart and her little brain. So, and that's why, I think the 4th or 5th episode, I gave it over to two young ladies who were straight out of high school, Gracie and Morgan, because I felt like it's important for the youth to have a voice, and I wanted to give my platform over to them to be able to talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. And so I'm hopefully going to do that again. Like, I don't want to always be on the show. I think it's cool to let other people have the show and talk about whatever is important, because there's a lot of stuff that I might think is important that's not, or there might be some things I don't know about. So
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
it's just it's just like a blank canvas for people to use in the podcasting world.
Absolutely. I'm with you there. I think storytelling is a lost art. I mean, aside from kind of the resurgence of podcasts and things like that, I mean, we really don't do it a whole lot anymore. And a lot of people don't care to listen anymore, which I think is a big thing, especially now more than ever.
100%. I know, it's like we live in a world where it's like, oh yeah, I come from a family of lawyers or doctors or insurance. And I'm fortunate where I really came from a family of artists. Usually with families, there's like that one artist of the family. Luckily for me, like my whole family was like the artist family. So
Yeah, absolutely.
What are some podcasts or people do you guys listen to? Like, are there any like podcasts or individuals that you guys like to listen to when you're just like out on a hike or whatever?
Let's see. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts. So
nice.
sort of
amazing.
A lot of the stuff you did. I recently I was in the car with my dad for like 20 hours. And so all we listened to was like true crime podcasts and some like comedy podcasts as well. So that's kind of what I'm into. But I've really enjoyed it. Growing up, I always told everyone I hated podcasts, but it's just because I couldn't focus for long enough. But then I actually started listening to them and was like, oh, I can get down with this. I like this.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Once I actually find something I like and am intrigued with, or again, a lot of it is finding things that I don't think I would be intrigued with, or people who you wouldn't expect to listen to for 2 hours on a podcast, and you end up enjoying it more than ever. I recently listened to a podcast with a lunch lady, and it was a 2-hour podcast, and it was one of the best podcasts that I've listened to, which is something you wouldn't expect listening to a podcast with a lunch lady. But
that's amazing.
Yeah. So I think that being able to find different people to put on podcasts and just hear the stories of so many different people, I think is just awesome. And especially in smaller communities. I guess it's a growing community for sure.
Yeah.
But smaller communities like Whitefish, Montana and Kalispell, Montana.
Oh, completely. And it's so, like, podcast is such an interesting term because people think it just means one thing, but really there's like storytelling, there's true crime. It's like, it's almost just like what the radio is or was. It's just people sharing stories, interviewing people. It's just so interesting that podcasting just is the blanket term for something that is just so broad. Mm-hmm. Some TV shows are like, I feel like, are a podcast. Like, I go onto YouTube and I'm watching something that's categorized as a podcast, but could just be like, an interview you see on the news or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's what's fun about it.
Yeah, totally. And when you're hearing stories, I'm sure you've heard the stories of a lot of different people now, having done the podcast for, how many episodes of the podcast do you have out now?
I think I only have like 20 episodes.
Okay, yeah. But even then, 20 stories, that's a lot. So with hearing the stories of so many people and creating that, creating the podcast, what are things that you've realized about communicating with people or asking people questions or advice that you might have for Code Girls that will help us learn how to ask questions better or listen better?
I think that's a great question. I think it's a mix when you're interviewing people in the capacity that, you're doing your podcast and I'm doing mine. It's half of it is questions that I want to know, things that I'm curious about.
Yeah. And
also questions that I think people would want to know that I might not find interesting, but making sure that it's a good mix of personal, like subjective and objective lines of questioning. And then just kind of like what you guys do, like having less of questions, but then just letting the conversation flow naturally is really important because it'll just go places that you might not think it's going to go.
Yeah.
And I'll hear my boss will go on some podcasts, and it's interesting seeing certain podcasters' intentions come through in their way of interviewing. And I guess what I mean by that is, like, some people are great listeners, and it's important to be a good listener and knowing when to be quiet when you're interviewing people. And some people will just, like, I've seen my boss go be guests on podcasts where he'll maybe get a word in every once in a while, and you can tell the podcaster is just really, they got a lot to say and they're just ranting and raving and they've got an interesting guest. But so I think it's just, and you're great at this, like just knowing how to listen and direct the conversation and letting it flow naturally. And sometimes it's okay to pause and take a break and to be like, let's ponder what we should talk about next.
Yeah, absolutely. So who's been your most interesting guest or like intriguing?
Probably the first two that come to mind is Patrick Uwaki and Erica Shelby. They're from they're Salish Kootenai, from the Salish Kootenai Reservation. I think having them on was a fascinating and eye-opening interview because with that one, and what I've been trying to do more is get guests from the reservations on because I feel like it's important for us as Montanans to build better bridges with communities outside of our own. It's so easy for us to kind of get in our bubbles, not just here in the Flathead, but like our Kalispell bubbles or Whitefish bubbles. And we forget that there's communities on the east side and then there's the reservations, which are dealing with a lot of really hard issues. I don't know if you knew this, but like Montana is the most dangerous state to live in if you're an Indigenous woman, with the highest rate of murder and violent crime and going missing in Montana. And so one of the things I've really tried to do is, or I'm trying to do is have people from different communities from the reservations come on to talk about these issues and stuff. In fact, Hello Whitefish is teaming up with DeliverFund to do an event. I'm going to do a plug now. Plug for an event I'm doing at the Wacholtz College Center on August 29th. We're doing a screening of a documentary I was fortunate to be a cinematographer on called Bring Them Home, produced by Lily Gladstone, the actor, Oscar-nominated actor. And the documentary is about the Blackfeet reintroducing bison into their ancestral wildlands.
Wow.
After bison almost went extinct when the U.S. cavalry tried to slaughter every single one to starve the native populations. Terrible. But yeah, it's an amazing documentary about the Blackfeet reintroducing bison into their ancestral wildlands. It took a long time. So we're doing a screening at the Wacholtz College Center on August 29th as a way to let the community see this awesome story and to get like an insight into the Blackfeet culture. And so we're super excited to do that. So long way of saying that's definitely one of my favorite conversations. I think that was episode 8. Definitely check it out. It's a really good interview with Patrick Uwaki and Erica Shelby. Talk a lot about just life on the reservations over there, some of the awesome stuff that's happening, and some of the hardships as well. So
yeah.
And then another really interesting one was with a really good friend of mine, Ken Browning, who at the time was a wildland firefighter. And I actually went out with him and filmed them rappelling out of helicopters that they trained to do like wildland firefighting practicing and stuff. And so that's another thing I've done with Hello Whitefish is doing these little micro documentaries where I go out in the field and I'll film some cool stuff and then post that. It's like, you know, I'm trying not just to do interviews, but like go film stuff and share and film stories out in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of on the topic of indigenous people in Montana, my grandfather is actually a chief on Fort Belknap Reservation in East Montana. So that's like near Harlem and the agency in Hayes.
Yep.
But that's an issue that hits super close to home for me. And like you said, storytelling kind of originates from there. But yeah, I grew up being like a camp counselor on the reservation and talking to these young people and doing trainings with these young people. And it was just another great thing to learn about that I think so many more people should do or at least hear about.
Completely.
Especially living in Montana, I think we're one of the states with a higher population of indigenous people and more reservations in our state. And I think it's huge to hear about. You know, it's shocking to me speaking to my peers in high school and noticing how little people know about the indigenous culture and about the issues that go on right next to us.
Oh, completely. I grew up with that same thing. And luckily for me, my parents actually befriended the Blackfeet chief. His name was Buster Yellow Kidney in the 80s. And so we ended up going out to Browning and East Glacier and Heart Butte and spending a lot of time out there, like as a kid. Yeah. And so like I loved going out there and all my friends who are Blackfeet and stuff. Some of my favorite people I've ever known. So
yeah.
But a lot of people don't get to have that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the truth. Yeah. Code Girls has gotten to do a little bit. I don't know if you've heard about this. We've gotten to do a little bit with the tribal. We have a handful of tribal programs, which is super, super awesome. And we get to kind of move our curriculum towards that culture instead of just, so we kind of differ our curriculum from what we might have in this headquarters in Kalispell, Montana versus the curriculum that we would have in Browning or Polson, to allow, like one of our first apps is like a quilt blanket and we have like a spirit animals app, which is super awesome. And so we get to make a lot of different things that are kind of keyed towards the native culture, which has been super awesome.
Oh, I mean, that's so important. I feel like, the Ivan and Ivy McDonald, who are the brother and sister of Blackfeet, who are the directors of this film, working with them, it's storytelling, like you said, is such a rich part of these tribes' culture. And I feel like cinema and filmmaking is really starting to take hold. And I'm sure technology, and once you offer these opportunities to these next generations of kids, man, I'm sure they're going to run with it and take it to amazing places that will hopefully like help support their families and the tribes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you might have already answered this, but this film that you're showing on August 29th.
Bring Them Home.
Bring Them Home. Is this geared towards, or I guess, is this about just Montana, or is this about Native people all over the U.S.?
It's definitely something tribes from all over the country can relate to because it's really it's about the Blackfeet, like a small group of Blackfeet who for, I think 40 years were trying to get a lineage of bison that were from that area back to bring them home to be able to go back onto their ancestral lands and be wild. And if you see the documentary, you'll kind of learn that bison are not as easily wrangled as cattle. Cattle ranching is the predominant way on at least the Blackfeet reservations where most people make their money. So people make way more money from cattle than they do bison. Bison take 3 times more amount of water. They'll break through fences. They go wherever they want. Right. And so it's been really difficult. But at the end of the story, they are able to finally reintroduce them, and they now have this amazing wild spot that they get to be free again and get to be how they were for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
And it really is like this huge victory for the tribes that have just gone through so much hardship. And so it's a very hopeful story and a very inspiring story.
Yeah, that's a beautiful journey. That is awesome. But I guess, I have one last question for you. And I've sort of touched on advice that you have for Code Girls. But again, just with Code Girls on Air or the podcast itself, or advice for listeners, just do you have any final pieces for us that you'd want to share today?
Yeah, I guess a couple things. Don't be afraid of reinventing yourself. That's what I learned from my father is he reinvented himself in so many freaking fascinating ways. And I've definitely done the same, whether because I wanted to do something new or because I was forced to make really hard life decisions and was just like, okay, well, I have to do something really difficult that I don't want to do, but I'm going to figure out how to hack this situation to make it work for me and my life. And so, I think just learning how to become a little bit of a hacker, which isn't just computer hacking, it's learning how to hack life is an important skill set to do and not being afraid to pivot. Just like learning everything you can about life so that you can make it work for yourself is one of the best ways to be a hacker, in my opinion.
All right. That is awesome. That is great advice. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Morgan. It was awesome to talk with you and hear about your journey.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was really an honor to be here in the studio today. You guys are doing killer work in here, so thank you.
Thank you.
Code Girls United needs your help to win a $10,000 incentive grant through the Whitefish Community Foundation's Great Fish Community Challenge. We need you and as many individuals as possible to make a gift of $25 or more during the week of August 29th through September 5th.
Visit www.codegirlsunited.org/donate to link to our giving page. Just $25 can have a meaningful impact for CGU and for girls in our communities. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode. Next week on Code Girls on Air.
And the thing that I would tell to women is don't give up your authentic self. Because the more you veer away from your authentic self, the more that you're just not going to either like what you do or like the person that you're becoming. Mm-hmm. And the more that you can bring your own authentic self to the role, the job, and what you're doing, the happier that you will be and the more confident you're going to be in your shoes.